Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is going to be, I think, the first time that I've done a movie review, but it's going to be about the movie, but then the broader historical context around it and how I see a lot of parallels with what's happening in the United States now and, providing us with some insight into what's to come potentially. And what to do about that. And I also want to share some personal anecdotes because this relates to history that impacted my family. So I'm talking about the film I'm Still Here. It's a Brazilian film. The title in Portuguese is Ainda Estou Aqui. The translation in English is a literal translation, I'm Still Here. This movie is up for various Oscar nominations. The Oscars are happening on March 2nd, so coming up soon. Be interesting to see how Ainda Estou Aqui does there on that international film stage. Ainda Estou Aqui is a film that is based on a true story about the forced disappearance and killing of a former congressman, Rubens Paiva, during the military dictatorship of Brazil. And the movie documents what happened to him and his family during this time. And I won't go into too much detail about the details of the movie to not have spoilers. I highly recommend that you see this film if you have the opportunity to. It's deeply moving. It's very well done. It's very good acting, but it's very moving. And I think is a reminder of how dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, all act the same. Sure, there's different flavors, there's different contexts, but there's definitely a roadmap. And this shares the Brazilian experience, one aspect of what the military dictatorship was like in Brazil. And I'm hoping that if Ainda Estou Aqui does well at the Oscars, that will keep it, in theaters longer and more people can see it. I really hope that more Americans can see it. It's done really well at the other award shows, but the Oscars is the big one for the movies. So, as I mentioned, this movie details the individual story of this man named Rubens Paiva and his family, and how they navigated the military dictatorship. And the military dictatorship, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the history of that. And then, as I mentioned, I also want to connect it to what I'm seeing, happening in the U.S. right now. And just, again, these patterns of when there are authoritarian regimes, when there are dictators, when there's an oligarchy, it's the same things, happen over and over. And what can we learn from this example so that we can perhaps avoid the worst of the abuses that are so typical of this type of government. So briefly, the Brazilian military dictatorship occurred from 1964 to 1985. And it was a military coup that ousted then President João Goulart. The U.S. government was complicit. The U.S. government did support the military coup. This was all about in the name of fighting communism. This was during the Cold War. And so the U.S. used that as an excuse to overthrow various governments around the world. Unsurprisingly as well, the Catholic Church was complicit in this military coup and military dictatorship. We've seen, the very religious, religious fundamentalism support authoritarian regimes the world over. And we're seeing that in the U.S. as well, the evangelical wing being a core part of Trump's base. So anyway, got a military coup, happens in 1964. For the next 21 years, Brazil is operating under a military dictatorship. There is mass censorship of media. There are extensive human rights abuses. People are tortured. The state engages in extrajudicial killings, meaning that like the state just randomly kills people. There's no court process. There's no justice. There's no rule of law. They just do. People are disappeared. Dissidents are exiled or, forced into exile because otherwise, they or their family would be harmed if they remained in Brazil. And yet at the same time, there was a period of the military dictatorship where there was great economic prosperity for Brazil. And so even in the midst of all of the human rights abuses and the torture and the disappearances and the forced exile and the lack of freedom of speech, there were many people who were apologists for the military dictatorship because of the economic gains. And I want to come back to this point later because we see it's something that comes up in the movie and then something we're seeing in the U.S. as well, of that leading to people, making excuses for the torture, making excuses for the human rights abuses. We even see that I won't dwell too long on this, but we even see that in in another country, for example, like in El Salvador right now. El Salvador has a dictator in charge. He declared martial law a few years ago. The country is very, the amount of human rights abuses that are happening are deeply alarming. And yet the president is very popular, with certain segments of the population, because people are claiming that El Salvador is a lot safer now. It's more economically prosperous. And again, this becomes a recurring theme in these types of regimes. And so that was one of the themes of the military dictatorship. And actually the peak of that economic prosperity during the military dictatorship in Brazil overlapped with the period in which Rubens Paiva, who is the focus of the film, his disappearance and his killing by the state, that overlapped. It's all around like the early 1970s. So the contrast, right, of what was happening at that time. And as I was mentioning as well, another detail, I'm going over like what are the points I wanted to make sure to hit. Only very recently, the United States in 2018 actually admitted that, released, I should say, In 2018, I read this, was interesting. In 2018, the United States released a memo from then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. My God, that man has so much blood on his hands. Kissinger had this memo from then during the military dictatorship in Brazil, again, that the U.S. supported in the name of fighting communism, that admitted that the leadership of the military government was fully aware of the killing of dissidents. They knew what they were doing. They knew that they were killing people extrajudicially. They knew that, even if they negated that in the press, which is one of the themes I'll come back to as well. And in the midst of, as I was mentioning, like some of the things that, even though this was like an incredibly, dangerous time to be seen as any type of quote unquote enemy of the state, and I put that in quotes because anything could get you labeled as a dissident. You didn't have to like actually do anything. You could just be, part of a minority group, or just be a journalist, or be a student, or be gay, or whatever. And you could be on a short list for being imprisoned and tortured. And even in the midst of that, there was economic prosperity for certain people, and that became an excuse to justify the harsh tactics of the regime. And also in 1970, again, in the midst of this particular story of the Paiva family, that Brazil won the World Cup in 1970. That was not the only time Brazil won the World Cup. Brazil has won the World Cup many times. But that also helped bring, a lot of positive press, a lot of pride to Brazil during this time. Brazilians are extremely proud when it comes to the topic of soccer. And so there were, let's say, other factors that allowed this, the military dictatorship to go on as long as it did. And so, there was one thing I read recently as I was preparing for this episode that I didn't know, that I found so fascinating because I think the parallel with the current context in the United States is so strong. So I learned that the slogan or the motto that the Brazilian military dictatorship adopted was Brasil, ame-o ou deixe-o. In other words, Brazil, love it or leave it. Love it or leave it. That was the slogan of the military regime in Brazil. And I was thinking about, how much, again, there's so many parallels between any type of autocratic government. But imagine how fitting that would be for the Trump administration to adopt, right? The United States, America, love it or leave it, right? It's a very typical nationalist perspective. Well, if you don't like it here, you should just leave. And I'm not even going to get into the psychology of why that's problematic. I just found it so on point and gross, but so fitting that was the slogan that the military dictatorship adopted. And going back to the film, I think one of the really important aspects of this film as well, it's not the only film that's ever been done about the military dictatorship in Brazil, but my understanding, and if there's someone listening who knows differently, please correct me, it's really the first one about the Brazilian military dictatorship that has reached a broad international audience. And this matters because, during that time in Latin America, there were many countries that were experiencing military dictatorships. Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, and there may be others. The Chile and Argentina are the ones I'm more familiar with. All of them, more, the years differ slightly from each country, but more or less in that time period, they were all going through that type of government, and the U.S. was involved in those other countries as well. And Chile and Argentina have films that have really reached the international cinema, catalog, that are well-known, well-respected, iconic films that just depict certain aspects of what happened in their countries. So for Chile, for example, there's the 2004 film Machuca, which focuses on the coming-of-age story of a young boy who lives during the dictatorship in Chile, and a friend of his, and the story of the two of them and their coming-of-age story during this time focuses on that friendship and their relationship during that time, and during the dictatorship of Pinochet. And then for Argentina, there's the 1985 film La Historia Oficial, which focuses on the story, one aspect of La Guerra Sucia, the dirty war, the dictatorship in Argentina, that talks about an aspect of how, which is another, unfortunately, very common aspect of dictatorships, that the children of poor women or dissident women, again in air quotes, women that were punished by the state during this time, if they were pregnant, oftentimes their children were taken from them and given to wealthy families through very kind of illegal, shady adoptions. And La Historia Oficial tells one of those stories. It's fictional, but it's based on true events. So I, as a Brazilian citizen as well, like I feel a certain level of pride in knowing that Brazil now has a film that I think will have the type of staying power that La Historia Oficial for Argentina and Machuca for Chile have. That decades from now, Ainda Estou Aqui, I'm Still Here, will be a film that people will reference to understand this dark chapter in Brazil's history. And I want to share, as I was watching the film and as I was processing the film, because it is heavy, I was thinking about the fact that, my mom's side of the family lived through the military dictatorship. Many of them were alive during that time and had various experiences. For some had really no impact whatsoever. And for others, there was more, of an impact, which I think is true of any of these experiences, right? Every regime eventually ends. Every authoritarian regime eventually ends. Every dictator eventually leaves office. Not everyone survives it. Not everyone makes it to the end of the reign, but it does eventually end. And I remember talking to one of my relatives who shared some anecdotes about his experience during the military dictatorship, and I want to just share a couple of those anecdotes. And one he told me about during part of these years he was in college, and he was at his university in class. There was always like two agents of the state who would sit in class with him and his peers. And they were there to, basically spy on the students, right? Higher education is always a focal point of authoritarian regimes, because that's where, people are learning these radical ideas. So he would go to class in college, and there would be like two agents of the state who would just sit in the class and just observe. And if anyone said something or behaved in a, questionable manner, the agents would like report them. Imagine like how scary that was. Talk about the chilling effect of that. And honestly, like how in current times, something like that isn't even necessary when we're all carrying around, smartphones and social media. The idea of surveillance of quote unquote subversives or dissidents takes on a whole new, level in the modern age, right? Where we have, these devices like the device I'm recording on that are absolutely tracked and monitored by tech companies who 100% are working with the government to spy and surveil and track U.S. citizens and residents of the United States, and that, tends to increase during these types of regimes. Anyway, another anecdote that this relative shared with me that is still dark, but it's funny. At the time, he, was renting a place with a couple of friends, and they had the unfortunate luck that some state agents at one point raided their home and, were searching through their belongings and in search of, any communist paraphernalia. And they took a bunch of books. They took a bunch of their sociology books. They took a bunch of stuff. But, according to this relative, he said that, these agents weren't the smartest guys, because in the house there was a copy of Das Kapital by Karl Marx, and they didn't take that in their search for communist propaganda, because they just saw the word capital and they were like, oh, that must be capitalism or something. So they left it. Anyway, so yeah, their sociology books got taken by state agents when their house was raided, but Das Kapital by Karl Marx was left behind. And he shared the experience of, that, a brother of a friend was imprisoned during the military dictatorship for quote unquote subversive activities, because he was working with rural people to help them improve their agricultural practices. And that was too communist for the government. So he was imprisoned. And fortunately, because somebody knew somebody, he was able to be released. But he was very lucky. There are many people who were disappeared and never heard from again, including Hubing Spaiva, who is, again, the focus of the film I was mentioning. I'm Still Here, Ainda Estou Aqui. And there were accounts of, in terms of how, the Brazilian government was disposing of people's bodies. I mean, just in the most sick ways. Throwing people into the sea from airplanes, throwing people into mass graves. A lot of people were disappeared during this time. And it wasn't that long ago. This is such recent history. Again, this is the 1960s to the 1980s. I'm sure lots of people listening to this were alive during that time, or you certainly have relatives within one generation of you, or maybe even the same generation as you, who lived during this time. I've talked in other episodes about more recent facets of Brazilian history, and I think that this helps provide greater context, right? Of modern democracy in Brazil only started in 1985. It's very recent. It's very, very recent. That's, someone born in 1985 is a millennial, an older millennial, but a millennial. That's just such an intense, it's such an intense thing. I mean, that person is only turning 40 years old, if they were born in 1985, only turning 40 years old this year. And it, because of that historical context, that lends to why, in Brazil, there's certain things that we see differently from in the United States. I've talked about in episodes before how voting is mandatory in Brazil, and for federal elections, voting is mandatory. And I think that there's pros and cons to that. There are pros and cons to that approach, but it's definitely influenced by the fact that for 21 years, immediately preceding this, there was a military dictatorship that influenced it. And so, going back to the film, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. There's themes that came up in the film that again, reminded me so much of the things we are seeing happen in the United States in these early days of the second Trump administration, which is 100% an authoritarian, dictatorial government that's honestly run by someone who's not even the president, right? Like, we all understand that Musk is calling the shots and using a lot of the same tactics that we see the world over throughout history when you have authoritarian regimes. And of course, there are different flavors because we've got this is like the tech bro era that has a particular flavor to it. But it's in comparing to prior phases of U.S. history. I've talked about how the current era parallels like the robber baron era, right, of about, a century ago. And this is just the modern era. Instead of like the railroad titans, we now have the tech titans making everything in their favor. So anyway, some of the themes in terms of the film that made me think about now. And again, I really recommend seeing the film. And I hope that it will win some Oscars. And as a result, it will stay in theaters in the U.S. longer so that more people have the chance to see it. But anyway, one of the themes. The idea of foreign media being more honest than domestic media about what's happening. And we're definitely seeing that, right? That not only did we see major newspapers anticipatorily capitulate to this authoritarian regime by rescinding their endorsements of Kamala Harris in last year's presidential election, including the LA Times, the Washington Post. We also see like the current mainstream media just being woefully inadequate in describing the danger of what we are going through, and foreign media doing a better job of being honest about what's happening, as well as, I would say, independent journalists. There's a lot of great independent journalists who are doing a good job of profiling what is actually happening, as well as some nonprofit media outlets like Rewire News. And related to the foreign media being more honest than domestic media, right, is the censorship that leads to the domestic media not being honest about what's happening and lying about what's happening. The self-censoring that's happening, as well as the active censoring. Like, we know that Trump is trying to defund public media like NPR and PBS, right? So that the idea being that then the only, free media, let's say, free news will be either the major newspapers that are controlled by, Trump sycophants, or they're the social media platforms owned by Trump sycophants, So definitely an attempt to consolidate media, to censor media, so that people are not given accurate information about the threat. Again, the idea of like anyone who challenges the state being labeled as a communist or a terrorist. And this isn't something we've seen yet in the United States, but this is something that happens frequently when you have oppressive regimes. And the movie talks about this, how, in response to the Brazilian military dictatorship, there were some people who took up arms to protest the military dictatorship. They formed, militias, they formed groups, and they took up arms. And one of the things that they would do to dissent from what was happening is that they would kidnap high-profile people in exchange for political prisoners, use the high-profile people, several foreign ambassadors, in exchange for getting political prisoners, getting people who had been incarcerated and unjustly released. And the movie talks about that as being one of the aspects of the violence begetting more violence during the military dictatorship in Brazil. And we see the same thing. We've seen the same thing in Ireland, in Palestine, in Spain, and I'm sure a million other countries whose histories I'm not as familiar with, right? Where because of the occupation, because of the oppression, because of whatever the autocratic regime was, that there is a certain group of resistance that will be armed resistance, and they use violent tactics like kidnappings of high-profile people as leverage to free dissidents, to advance their political agenda as well. Again, the idea of the state disappearing people and then denying that they've disappeared people. I hope that this is something we don't reach in the United States. I hope that people continue to push back as people have been pushing back, and it is working. It's not going to work with everything, but Trump has already had to back off on several things that he's tried to do because the public has been putting political pressure on elected representatives, and some of the courts, thank God, are still holding firm. The Supreme Court we cannot rely on, but some of the lower courts are like, no, we can't just stop government funding overnight. We can't just defund all National Institute of Health research, But it also made me think about the state disappearing people and then denying it and not being able to understand where people have been taken, which is again, the center of the story of Ainda Estou Aqui. Rubens Paiva's wife, Eunice Paiva, the movie actually really ends up focusing on her and her battle to find out what happened to her husband. And it reminded me, I'm making this analogy. I don't want to minimize absolutely at all the horrific stuff that happened during the Brazilian military dictatorship. But it reminded me of in a small way of I was trying to locate a client who is in ICE custody. And there's a database that you can look up online to locate where someone is, which ICE detention center they are. And I know he is in their custody because he's contacted family to let them know where he is, but he's not showing up in the locator. So, it's he's in the government's custody, and yet I can't find that information. It's a very scary feeling. It's a very disorienting feeling. And I talked about that. You know what? It does always eventually end. It does always eventually end. Not everyone survives it, but it does always eventually end. And the theme of the film, I'm Still Here, Ainda Estou Aqui, talks about that, right? And the endurance and knowing that even if it is so dark and can last a long time, it's never forever. We talked about the prosecution, right, of anyone seen as challenging the status quo, journalists, members of opposition parties, queer people, students, professors. We absolutely see the targeting, right, in the United States of immigrants, of trans people, of gay people, of Black people, right? All of the anti-DEI stuff is just straight up racism. There's only two genders, and banning transgender athletes from the NCAA. It's all very typical actions to target those that are seen as non-conforming. The attacks on science, the policing of speech. The film also talks about police checkpoints. And I knock on all the wood that this does not become something we start to see. But we know that police checkpoints are a very common feature of authoritarian regimes around the world, which has become a tool to harass, to surveil, to assault, and instill fear in people. The defunding of higher education, and the making it more difficult to to get an education. This isn't one that is directly addressed in the film, but the film made me think about it because I was thinking about how, higher education always ends up. I was mentioning this relative of mine, right, who had like state agents surveilling his college classes, and how it is always a tactic of oppressive regimes to defund higher education because they don't want an educated populace, to be able to fight back. And we see, Trump trying to do the same thing, absolutely attacking public education and including higher education. And it made me think about, which again, I really hope doesn't happen here, but what's often happened in other countries where this happens, so there isn't enough money then. And then professors will go on strike because they're not getting paid. And so, students can't continue with their studies. It takes much longer for them to complete their degrees. And this is something that is common in Brazil, in Colombia, in Chile, I'm sure in many other countries. But this is one of the common fallouts of the effort to defund higher education, the instability that then creates, and then it leads to strikes, and then there's oppression of the strikes, and then students, it takes longer to graduate, serious instability. And at the end of the film, there's this really poignant scene where Eunice Paiva, as I mentioned, Rubens' wife, she's fought for decades to learn the truth about what happened to her husband. And she's being interviewed by a journalist. And this is now, the military dictatorship is long over. And a journalist being like, what's really, why are we looking into the past? Like, shouldn't the new democratic government be focused on the present? Like, why do we need to be focusing on the past? Doesn't the government have better things to do? And, she disagrees, and she's like, it is absolutely essential. And Eunice says this. It's absolutely essential that we look to the past and we fix the past and we compensate victims and we bring to justice those who abuse, those who perpetrated human rights violations, because otherwise there's no way to prevent this from continuing to happen, from happening again. And gosh, that argument of like, shouldn't we just move on? Like, isn't it so divisive to be continuing to harp on the past? Can't we really need to focus on our commonalities and working together and moving forward. That's just going to divide the nation even more if we continue to harp on that. We need to come together and just move forward and forget that. I mean, this argument about needing to move on, oh my God, it's such a common argument when it comes to Trump, right? Which has contributed to him coming to power again and more abuse is happening. Because we moved on without accountability. And there's many people to blame for that. I'm not even going to get into that. But this idea that no, we just move on from the past. No, that's how you guarantee that it will happen again. You need to compensate victims. You need to bring to justice people who abused during that time. You need truth and reconciliation commissions. And there are models for that. We have countries like Germany and Rwanda who have done that in, relatively successful ways. But, the United States is not, we haven't even done it about slavery, much less more recent events. And it just keeps happening, right? It happened after the Civil War, after the 2008 housing market crash, after the first Trump administration, right? These terrible, terrible things happened. And we just moved on without accountability for those who abused their power, without compensation for the victims, right? Formerly enslaved people were not given land, were not given the, 40 acres and a mule. They were simply left to poverty. There was no, this argument that again, comes up in the film in talking about now that, Brazil is no longer under military dictatorship, what should the new government be focusing on? And Amnesty talks about the importance of you need to address the past so that the past doesn't repeat itself or continue for that matter. And it's so on point for what we're seeing now. And I find it so egregious, the arguments of, we just need to move beyond it. No, you need to hold people accountable. And you need to compensate victims. That's how we ensure it doesn't happen again. And because we didn't, that is a big contribution to why we're having a second Trump presidency, right? Even in the cases where he has been found guilty of criming and breaking the law a million times over, there hasn't been actually any accountability. It has not cost him anything. And I have done many episodes about my anti-carceral views. That's not what I'm talking about. Accountability can come in many different shapes and sizes, okay? Like, for example, just to throw out one example, Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, who was involved in leading a coup attempt to overthrow the last presidential election in Brazil that he lost. He has been held accountable through the Brazilian judicial system, such that he is barred from holding office. Now, it's not forever, and there's many other, that's just one part of the puzzle. But that seems to be a fitting thing, that if you try to overthrow a democratic election, that there is a period of time that you are not allowed to hold public office. That hasn't happened to Trump, right? And whatever, our system is different. I'm just throwing it out there that accountability can look in many different ways. And we didn't do it. And we're not compensating victims. And the point made in the film Ainda Estou Aqui about this is so pertinent to the current moment in the United States. And as a result of that as well, and this is something I think is likely to happen because it seems to happen after every dictatorship. I was mentioning that there are apologists, in Brazil for the military dictatorship. When it's all over, when it's all said and done, and there will still be people who are apologists for the dictatorship, and say, well, it was safer then. We were economically better. All this stuff. And those people still exist in Brazil. I mean, that was a huge part of Bolsonaro's messaging, right? He is a military dictatorship apologist. He was championing a return to that type of government. And when the Trump era is finally over, there will also be people, I think likely, who will also be apologists for this time as well, who will also say, well, this, and the other. It was good for this and this. I mean, obviously, there's plenty of people already apologizing for him and, believing he's a good thing. But even when it's all over and, all is revealed about all of the shady things that were done, there's still people who will be like, it was still okay. I mean, that's how we also got a second Trump regime in the first place, right? There will be people who say, well, it was a safer time. Well, safer, but by what standard, right? Safe because if you do something that the government considers wrong, they will disappear you. That's frightening. That's so frightening. And anyway, I don't mean for this episode to be terrifying. I just mean that history does repeat itself, that there are patterns to each type of authoritarian regime. And therefore, there are ways to combat that because so many of the tactics are the same. And I think it is a scary time. And as I've talked about in prior episodes, there are many ways to get through such a time. And you have to find the way that is most fitting for you and your loved ones and your family and for yourself. And that may change over the course of this time, depending on conditions, depending on your wherewithal, depending on your means. And, but the public will prevail. We can continue to push back so that we don't get to these worst stages, and it will at some point end. Not everyone will make it to the end, but it will end at some point. And I really hope that because of the prominence of this film right now, and again, I hope that Ainda Estou Aqui will win some Oscars on March 2nd, including the actress who plays Eunice Paiva. Her name is Fernanda Torres. She's up for Best Actress, I believe. Pop culture matters. Pop culture matters. Pop culture can sway things. And I think it's just an opportunity. Like, this film is such an opportunity to help educate the American public about what can happen. And I'm not saying everyone who watches it is going to make all these connections and, okay. But that's part of why I did this episode, because I was like, oh gosh, I see all these connections. But also, being on the Oscar stage, I think, brings more attention to the film and hopefully brings more pressure to bear that we will not let go of democracy so easily. That in fact, we would like to remain a democracy, even if there are those who would really prefer to not have to abide by the will of the people. And I know that it's not a perfect democracy and there's lots of problems. Okay, I get it. But come on, you get what I'm saying, okay? All right, that's enough for today. I could say so much more about this film, and it's really inspired me to start asking more of my relatives about what their experiences were like, learn more about my own history, frankly, and talking to friends who've had family live through autocratic regimes, and know that, we've been here before, and what can we learn from that? And when this is over, I really hope, that we can get that truth and that truth and reconciliation, and not this inane, bipartisan looking forward only aspect. No, there has to be healing. There has to be compensation. And, when we heal, we can move forward, right? Which is the theme I've talked about, right? Hurt people. Healed people, right, are far less likely to hurt others. So we need healing and prevention. So anyway, okay. Go see Ainda Estou Aqui. I'm still here. You have the opportunity to. I know it's still in theaters. And hopefully it'll still be even longer following the Oscars on March 2nd. Let me know your thoughts. If you've seen the movie, what you thought. Other comparisons, other parallels that you noticed. I welcome those. And thanks so much for listening. And I'll see you next time.